All right, before we get going, I just want to say that my co-chair, Jane Osmers, has been on Fridays at 1 for the last 6 years, doing a fantastic job. And I just, want to give my appreciation, and I hope you all will too. Thank you, Jane. So, welcome to Fridays at 1. Fridays at 1 is presented by the Institute for Retired Professionals, or the IRP. Most of you are very familiar with the IRP. But the IRP started 54 years ago, I think that's correct, as a pioneering lifelong learning group, and it functions as a peer-to-peer learning institution. So students teach each other in some 35 seminar classes each semester. So Fridays at 1 is just one of many activities at the IRP. Today we're pleased to present Tom Vinciguerra, author of Cast of Characters, a group portrait of the stars of the New Yorker in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. During those golden years, Wolcott Gibbs, James Thurber, E.B. White, and other brilliant writers and editors at the New Yorker transformed how life in America was perceived and written about. Tom Vinciguerra is a founding editor of The Week and a regular contributor to the New York Times. Tom previously edited a collection of Wolcott Gibbs's New Yorker articles entitled Backward Ran Sentences. After his talk, Tom will be available to sign copies of his book, Cast of Characters, which is available for purchase over there at that table. Welcome, Tom Vinciguerra.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here. Back in 2011, when I published the anthology, Backward Ran Sentences, I had a New School Roundtable in this room with Kurt Anderson of Studio 360 and Mark Singer of The New Yorker itself. And now I'm going solo, and I hope you approve. I'd like to talk for a bit about the first generation or so of the people who put together the New Yorker magazine, the cast of characters, as I call them. I'll also read you an excerpt, take your questions, and read another excerpt or even two when you can't think of any more questions. And I will conclude with a very interesting short piece of film, which will be a surprise. It has an interesting story connected with it. Now, many books have been written about the New Yorker, and in fact, when I started mine 10 years ago, I got a warning from Jason Epstein, who used to be editorial director of Random House. He said, "Tom, I'd hate to see you waste your time with this. The last thing the world wants or needs is another book about the New Yorker." Fortunately, I think Cast of Characters is not just a book about the New Yorker. It's a group portrait of some of its major players during a certain period. And that period was the quarter century between the magazine's founding in 1925 and the death of its founder, Harold Ross, in 1951. Ross was a newspaperman from Aspen, Colorado. He was coarse and brusque, but he was very literate. And he wanted to run a smart weekly reflection of New York life. Starting in the Roaring '20s, he succeeded against all odds and all expectations. The New Yorker that you read today is very different from the one that Ross founded. Its focus is now national and international. It has many ideas and opinions. And I don't think Ross would have welcomed some of its current showcase writers, like Malcolm Gladwell and Janet Malcolm, because they do a lot of thinking. And William Shawn, Ross's successor, once said that Ross didn't care about what any reporter thought. As Shawn put it, Ross liked what he regarded as pure information. His working assumption, at least, was that there was such a thing as objective reporting. He wanted to know about events. He did not want to know what a writer's subjective response to events was. What Ross wanted 91 years ago was to explore New York and metropolitan life. He emphasized wit, gaiety, and genteel cynicism. This meant focusing on colorful places and personalities. It meant light nonsense stories, what were then called casuals. It meant whimsical musings on current events, brief reviews of theater, movies, books, and other culture, and of course, funny cartoons. Now, the Algonquin Round Table played a part in this, and Ross leaned on some of its members, like Robert Benchley, Dorothy Parker, and Alexander Wolcott, to provide him with material. But he couldn't rely on them consistently. And so he assembled his own roster, the cast of characters on whom I focused. One of them was E.B. White. Long before he wrote Stuart Little and Charlotte's Web, he was the voice of the magazine. White set the pace for the front of the book with notes and comment, his wry and sometimes poetic observations about people, places, and things of the day. In his very first comment about the building of the Hayden Planetarium, White captured the tone that Ross wanted. He wrote, "Most persons in their earthly glee are too forgetful of the heavenly bodies." At the Hayden, he said, the moon and stars would pursue their course with marvelous intimacy. Nothing really is more exciting, and surely New York is the city nearest the sky. That was White. Another member of the cast was Catherine Sargent Angel, a genteel woman of refined literary tastes and a Bryn Mawr grad to boot. Thanks to Catherine, the New Yorker became a serious magazine for fiction, featuring authors like John Cheever, Gene Stafford, and J.D. Salinger. Maybe her greatest achievement was recruiting E.B. White into the fold, and she ended up marrying him. And then there was James Thurber, the cartoonist who drew people so misshapen and lopsided that Dorothy Parker said they had the semblance of unbaked cookies. He was a master of wordplay and fantasy, and he memorably chronicled the battle of the sexes. His classic story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, practically defined the cliche of the harassed husband and the domineering wife. There was also John O'Hara, who pretty much invented what became known as the New Yorker short story. The rakish cartoonist Peter Arno, who famously sketched an engineer walking away from a plane crash and muttering, "Back to the old drawing board." And Charles Addams, the creator of the Addams Family. My central character is Wolcott Gibbs. Apart from Harold Ross, he may have been the magazine's most indispensable figure. He's remembered today mainly for a major spoof of Time magazine, which doubled as a profile of Time's co-founder, Henry Luce. When Gibbs wrote the profile in 1936, Time was scurrilous, inaccurate, obsessed with epithets like snaggletooth and pig-faced. Its syntax was weird and inverted. Gibbs captured all of this perfectly in the following parodic passage. Always mentioned as William Randolph Hearst's great and good friend was cinema actress, that was a Time conflation, Marion Davies. Stressed was the bastardy of Ramsay MacDonald, the cozy hospitality of Mae West. Backward ran sentences until reeled the mind. Gibbs was also a savage drama critic when he reviewed A.B.'s Irish Rose, which was a terrible, terrible perennial chestnut of a melodrama. He wrote, "It had, in fact, the rather eerie quality of a repeated nightmare. The one, perhaps, in which I always find myself in an old well, thick with bats, and can't get out." Gibbs was the New Yorker's all-around workhorse. He wrote a pile of comic sketches, serious short stories, and hysterical parodies of writers like Hemingway and Sinclair Lewis. He also did profiles, like one of a theater publicist named Richard Maney, who hated his clients, and a woman named Rita Ross, no relation to Harold Ross, who made her living by rounding up stray cats. Gibbs was also a superb editor. He would often lop off the first couple of paragraphs of a manuscript and say, "This will cut like butter," and it usually did. He once told his colleagues, "Try to preserve an author's style if he is an author and has a style." Once he was going over a manuscript with John O'Hara. O'Hara became increasingly impatient, and finally he yelled, "Gibbs, you're my story!" And he stormed out. Yet today he's almost totally forgotten, maybe because he was so self-effacing, or maybe because he was so sour. Someone once said, "God, he must be brilliant. He doesn't like anything." And Ross replied, "Maybe he doesn't like anything, but he can do everything." Whatever the reason, Gibbs probably worked more closely with more people at The New Yorker than anyone except for Ross. And that's why I've made him the focus of my book and put him at the center of my action. I've given some space in cast of characters to how The New Yorker was put together in the 30s and 40s and 50s. One chapter is all about the editing process, everything from comma placement to Ross's obsession with clarity. He once yelled, "God damn it! All I know about English is what I read in a little red grammar book, and Jesus Christ, this ain't it!" I also have a chapter about the famous New Yorker cartoons. For years, Ross and his cohorts would gather on Tuesday afternoons for 3 hours or so to review hundreds of submissions. They'd be held up or put on an easel, and about half a dozen editors would poke at them with knitting needles to point out flaws. And here too, Ross was a stickler for detail. Once he got so consumed with the rendering of a PT boat that he insisted on consulting the manufacturer for the shape of its torpedo tubes and the contour of its windshield. I'm guessing that you're more interested in the people themselves than in the process, and before I take your questions, I'm going to touch on a few more of these people. Like Daisy Terry, the office manager, she tyrannized the typing pool, and she told new staff members never to speak to Ross. She was not popular among the secretaries, said Catherine White, because she was a hard taskmaster and did not approve of romance or marriage, and was very upset when they went out with editors for lunch. She was so efficient that Gibbs complained, "She is always monkeying around with the papers in my baskets, and I wish there was something in there that would bite her, but there isn't." Another important figure was Freddie Packard, the head of the fact-checking department. He was fanatical about accuracy. When he found that Joe Lewis's name had been misspelled in the magazine, he broke down and cried in public. And he loved catching sources in error or just plain nonsense. He once discovered that a certain wine company produced a California Chianti that was bottled in New York. Packard once asked the Justice Department if the position of executive assistant to the administrative assistant of the Assistant Attorney General actually existed. No, the Justice Department said. However, they did have an executive assistant to the Attorney General, an administrative assistant to the Attorney General, and the assistant to the Attorney General. There was also a flamboyantly gay editor named John Mosier, and his chief joy was turning down contributors' work. Often he would go out to lunch, but he would break things off early, just so he could say, "I must get back to the office," and reject. And someone once spoofed one of his rejection slips thus: "Sorry, this isn't quite right for us. We find that it's rather slight for us. A shade, just a shade, too light for us. And of course, just a trifle thin. Although you sound like a jerk to us, and reading your stuff is an irk to us, please send more of your work to us. We like to have oodles come in." John Glessman, my editor at Norton, by the way, said that he thought that poem was worth the price of the book, so. And then there was St. Clair McKelway, who was managing editor during the late 1930s. He was a handsome, charming newspaperman who edited the Bangkok Daily Mail, for which he was paid his salary in gold. McKelvey was married 5 times, and he was as nutty as a fruitcake. He figured he had 12 personalities. Some of them, William Shawn said, were practical. Others were imaginative, and none of them were earthbound. They were oddballs, to be sure, but they helped define the early New Yorker. Before I turn things over to you, I'll read you an excerpt about one last member of the cast, a fellow named Russell Maloney, who was on the staff from 1934 to 1945. Maloney wrote Talk of the Town stories, profiles, and many comic pieces. Like most of his colleagues, he had his problems, and here are just a few paragraphs about that. Maloney had started selling cartoon ideas to the New Yorker when he was still an undergraduate at Harvard, and 2 years after he graduated, Catherine White recruited him to the staff. It was a rapid rise, but to Maloney's mind, it led nowhere. After a few years of talk rewrite and other comedic duties, he found himself bored. It didn't help that, like all talk contributors, he toiled in anonymity. He was sensitive, too, and thus ill-equipped for an office where prankish insults and put-downs were routine. Arguably underappreciated, and certainly overworked, especially during the war, he felt himself capable of better things. In 1943, when Clifton Fadiman quit as the magazine's chief book reviewer, Maloney lobbied for the job. When it went to Edmund Wilson, Maloney, quote, went stomping into Ross and told him that this time positively he had gone too far. In short, Maloney felt that professional growth had eluded him. As far as I can tell, I have managed to stand completely still, he complained. My first piece might have been my last, and my last my first, as far as any merit is concerned. During the first half of the 40s, he tried variously to wrest from Ross a substantial raise, an exclusive service contract, and more responsibility on his terms. He got nowhere. Ross valued Maloney, so much so that when the latter became convinced that the bottles in the office water coolers were being filled by a Greek from a faucet in a mop closet and were thus unsanitary, Ross wrote a 2-page memo on the subject and paid a local chemist $10 to test the stuff. It displayed no evidence of bacterial pollution, by the way. But the extraordinary effort of getting out a magazine starved for both personnel and resources during wartime didn't allow him to indulge the temperamental writer. He had his own explanation for why Maloney quit. He was frustrated in his desire to be a critic, Ross told O'Hara, which I would never let him be, because I didn't think he had the balance, the judgment, and the character to be a critic. He's influenced almost exclusively by personalities, as nearly as I can see, is a disgruntled soul, and a critic has got to have objectivity. Certainly Maloney's forays into criticism could be unfortunate, never more so than in 1939 when he slammed The Wizard of Oz as having no trace of imagination, good taste, or ingenuity. He called it a stinkeroo. Unable to accept that criticism was perhaps not his strong suit, he began to see conspiracies. One day he announced, "The giants have come down from the hills." Actually, it was only E.B. and Catherine White. They were giants, all right, but not benign ones, Garrity mused. That was James Garrity, the longtime art director of the magazine. Not benign ones, not to Maloney. To him, they were ogres out to get him. His greatest jealousy and hatred was of Gibbs. White vividly remembered Maloney during the war in his gas mask and helmet, ready to save everybody in New York, except Gibbs. When Gibbs temporarily couldn't continue as the main comment writer because he'd fallen down and broken 2 fingers, Maloney was elated. During contract negotiations with Ross, he pressed for such outlandish concessions as a bonus of twice the difference between Gibbs's yearly income and mine, if mine is smaller, and a definite offer of the theater column when Gibbs goes too crazy to write it anymore. Whence came this enmity? Gibbs suspected that he'd driven his colleague crazy through an act of mistaken kindness, namely introducing Maloney to his future wife, Miriam Batista. One night when he first came to town, Gibbs said, he told me he didn't know any girls, so I said, there's nothing easier. And I called up Miriam, who was working in a show called Mulatto. I'm afraid I told him in effect that she was a sure lay. A month or so later, I remembered to ask him how he had made out, and of course he never spoke to me again, because they were married. Gibbs personified everything Maloney wished to be: a witty man about town, a wearer of many editorial hats, an arbiter of taste. Actually, Maloney was already well established in that persona, and with a few more years of seasoning, he might have achieved it entirely. But stymied in his early 30s, Maloney became convinced that Gibbs was out to do away with me, and so he determined to destroy him. And what follows is an excerpt from a letter that Maloney sent to his family that I got from his daughter. It's an extraordinary letter. Maloney: I started reading comment very carefully every week. Whenever I found an error in judgment or grammar, a phrase or an idea that Gibbs had used too often, or something that was inconsistent with something he'd said before, I'd write duplicate memos to Ross and Sean. I did this for about a year. Then one week, Gibbs had an ill-made little sentence about somebody or other being in his customary dilemma. I wrote a little memo that Fowler, the grammarian, would have been proud of, pointing out that a dilemma is something you don't get into voluntarily, and that Gibbs must have been trying to say usual dilemma. I remember I had several sentences illustrating proper uses of the different words, like Gibbs had his customary dinner of 8 martinis, and next morning had his usual hangover. And Gibbs took his customary crack at Jed Harris's latest play because Harris once rejected a play he had written. And I said that even if I wasn't considered enough of a stylist to write really important things, at least I'd never used words I didn't understand. 2 weeks later, Sean was put in charge of comment, and I was asked to contribute. And after about 6 months of my doing it, in competition with Gibbs, he announced that he was sick and tired of doing this boresome drivel and wanted to be an editor again. I wish I could put into words the satisfaction it gives me to think about this. It's like lying on a feather bed and being massaged by angels. Well, that's typical of the people in this book. When my late mother read it, she said that she thought it was well written. She gave me that much. But she also said that everyone in it was crazy. And she wasn't entirely wrong. Just the same, these folks produced some extraordinary work, and I'm very happy in all the time that we have and that you want to tell you more about it and them. Thank you, and fire away. Are we using the microphone? Yeah.
Where are the microphones?
Yep. You told us a bit about what the New Yorker was like and how it changed. I'm wondering whether anyone did research on what the audience was like that read the original New Yorker and how the audience has changed.
The best answer to that very good question can be found in Ben Yagoda's book about town.
And if I don't read it, I'm wondering what the answer.
Well, you know, it's funny. I'll do my best to answer it. Maybe I can't, and I must tell you, Ben, he wrote a fine book, and he reviewed my book for the Wall Street Journal. But he got a little upset with me because I didn't answer a lot of questions that he had, including the magazine's effect on the culture. That wasn't my orientation. I would say the audience certainly got bigger, and it really boomed after World War II because, and this is a fairly well-known story, servicemen had gotten hooked on the magazine because they produced. Ross's first wife was really responsible for producing what they called, you may have heard this term, a pony edition of the magazine. It was basically just a downsized 24-page distillation of the magazine. I mean, the paperback trade among servicemen was booming. They had to have something to read because they would get bored out of their minds. Servicemen got hooked on the New Yorker. I think the demographic of the New Yorker became increasingly affluent and increasingly suburbanized. I can't speak with any real authority to the overall readership, but I do think that the rather jazzier urban dwellers who Ross was initially going for became increasingly middle class, suburbanized, and affluent.
Hi. Did Ross have any conception of what an editor after him would be like, if in case he ever died? And how do you think he would have reacted to the fact that Sean became the editor, or would he have preferred one or the other?
It's a great question, especially because it stands in such contrast to Sean's almost Hamlet-like indecision over who was going to succeed him. I don't think Ross gave much consideration to who was going to succeed him, but I am absolutely convinced that for him, it couldn't have been anyone other than Sean. I use a phrase, I found a letter that Ross had written in 1939, and this was a dozen years before he died. He called Sean the shepherd of the fact stuff. In those days, and this is still largely true, there was a pretty rigorous division between fact and fiction. The fiction editor was a very gentlemanly fellow named Gus Lebrano, and when Ross died, the big thing was who's going to succeed Ross? Is it going to be Lebrano or Sean? There was never really any doubt that Sean was going to succeed Ross, and Sean had been a reporter, not nearly as itinerant a one as Ross, but Ross saw in him a continuation of his repertorial instinct. And so, although Ross did not designate a successor, he would have been pleased that it was Sean, and it was ultimately up to Raoul Fleischman, the publisher of the magazine, who gave Sean the nod. Yeah.
I've been a New Yorker reader for 1,000 years. It has always seemed to me that stories at the New Yorker are longer and more full of anything you ever wanted to know. Was this a policy that stories just went on as long as the author could churn them out?
Yeah, there's a wonderful expression in the news magazine trade. I learned it many years ago. If a writer is going on too long about a given subject, the expression is, this tells the reader more about penguins than he wants to know. I think the mold started to be set with Hiroshima in 46, the John Hersey. That piece was 31,000 words long. Now, I wouldn't cut a word of it. I would not have cut a word of it. I don't think, though, that the gigantism that you're referring to really began in earnest until Sean. I think that under Ross, there were any number of multi-part series. I think they were very, very crisply done, full of information, sharply written. I wish I knew more about Sean. I know a fair amount about him. Frankly, and he was a very, very good editor, but I do think that he indulged writers and infantilized them to a certain extent. and that by giving them as much space as they needed, he was often very vague about how long an article should be. I do think that he made them dependent on him to a certain extent. He was a very strong person underneath a very quiet exterior. That's sort of after the period that I write about. Yeah, I can show it any time. I can read first. I can do. I was going to save it for dessert, but I can do it now. Okay. I think you'll find this quite compelling. Gibbs loved Fire Island. It was the one place on earth where he was really happy. He had very fond childhood memories of the South Shore. And he had a summer house on Fire Island for 20 years. In 1954, he founded a weekly newspaper called The Fire Islander. And it's still going. It's called the Fire Island News. And a couple of years ago, 3 years ago I think now at this point, when I was doing my research at the main branch on 42nd Street, I found the name of one of his young editors of 60 years ago, Constantine Carvonides. I tracked him down in Maine, and he gave me some wonderful stories. For instance, he told me that as the first issue was going to press, Gibbs and the printer both got drunk. Gibbs and Constantine took a cab back to the city, but they had no money. And so Gibbs had the cabbie stop at 21 so he could borrow $50 from the doorman. The doorman was so startled that he gave him $100. And at that point, Constantine told me, the cabbie was thinking to himself, "Get me the F out of here." Constantine gave me the film that I'm about to show you. It's about 4 minutes long. And it's an NBC News segment about Gibbs and Carvonides and the rest of the Fire Islander gang putting together an early issue of the newspaper. Constantine boxed it up and addressed it to me a while ago, a 16-millimeter roll of film. He died last spring before he could get it off to me. But his daughter sent it to me last summer, and I knew exactly what was in the box as soon as I saw the last name. Now, the first and the last portions are silent, and that's probably where the news narration went in. I'll walk you through it and point out the people. And as far as I know, it's the only known footage of Wolcott Gibbs, and I'm very happy to share it with you. So could we have the lights, please? That's Ocean Beach. That's the approach from the ferry. And this is the main drag. And that is, on the right, Tony Gibbs, Wolcott's son, with whom I'm in touch. He's 80 now. He was my main source on this book. And that's his mother, Eleanor, besides him. This was their office. Bill Birmingham was one of Gibbs's very, very best friends. He ran a waterfront real estate office on Ocean Beach. He was one of Gibbs's two partners in the paper, and this is where they put it together, in the office. And that's Gibbs in the dark shirt.
As far as our next issue goes, as you all know, we have a piece from Fred Allen, which I think is very funny. The week after that would be Abe Burrows, so we're pretty well taking care of feature writers. As to the art, we have Charlie Adams and a piece by Mary Petty. So as far as the features go, I think we're pretty well fixed. That brings us to news. Now the main story this week will be the trustees meeting. What have you got on that?
We don't have anything on the trustee meeting yet. It was a closed meeting. However, I do have an appointment with the acting mayor this afternoon, and I'll be able to get the story from him then.
That was St. George Bryan. He was a cub reporter on the Fire Islander. His brother was Cortland Bryan, who wrote Friendly Fire, which you may remember. And Tony didn't think much of him. He thought he was a total incompetent.
Herman, we have this picture of Charlie Adams, and you know a great deal more about these things than I do. How would you reproduce that? I mean, size and...
Wolcott, this definitely calls for a half-tone, and if we reduce it to 3 columns, I think it will come up splendidly.
That was Herman Wexler. He was Gibbs's other partner in the Fire Islander. He owned an art gallery, And he was very cultured. He had traveled and learned from Meyer Shapiro. I'm in touch with his daughter and his widow. She's still alive.
Tony, I know how we've done in Ocean Beach this week, but what have you heard from the other towns?
And here's Tony again.
We're all right everywhere except Fair Harbor and Bay Shore. We're sold out there.
Tom, what do you think about advertising this week? Would you say 8 or 10 as we stand now?
And that's Constantine Carbonides.
It'll be 8 this week.
Bill, what were you planning to put in your column this week?
Well, I've gathered some more information about the sunken forest.
How long do you
Bill Birmingham.
suppose it would run?
I expect it will run 2 columns without a carry.
Well, that's about right, I think. Well, as far as I can see, we're all pretty well set, so I just suggest we all go fishing.
Gibbs loved to fish. He really did. Gibbs's house. It was washed out to sea in the hurricane of '62, and he built that porch with money that he made from his Broadway play, Season in the Sun. And when he didn't want people to see him, he would crouch down behind it. My mother thought that was machine gun fire. Look what it is. He's wearing cufflinks on the beach. And that's Eleanor.
You want to take a look at this thing? Gee, I don't know. How about that? Is that the way to spell that guy's name?
No, that isn't quite right.
No?
No.
How do you spell it?
She's editing him.
B-U-R-R-O-G-H-U-S.
No,
No.
it's B-U-R-R-O-W-S.
Oh, yes, I'm...
Otherwise it's fine.
Fine.
Otherwise it's fine.
So look, when you saw Thurber in town, what did he say?
He said he'd be glad to write another piece.
You think you'll have it in by next week?
I think if you call him, he could.
Well, I certainly will, because we need him very badly.
I know.
And this is the tag. The sound is off again. Again, the narration probably going in here. And here they are reviewing proofs and galleys. There's Wexler, Gibbs, Constantine, and St. George. Back to the main drag, and here we are with the finished product. Gibbs once said that he only wanted it sold in stores because he didn't want kids yelling, hawking it on the sidewalks, but they did. So there you go with that. I'll take any more questions. I do have a couple of excerpts, one of them about Gibbs's sex life.
Gibbs's sex life.
Okay. But first.
Well, you mentioned Hiroshima and John Hersey, but then we began to get novels by Salinger and, of course, In Cold Blood. Who instigated that? How did that happen?
I think that in general, and believe me, my research on this is far from original. Many New Yorker authors during the Ross era had come out with, I would say, mainly collections of pieces and collections of short stories that had originally found a home in the magazine. When you got into really long narrative nonfiction that was practically book length in the magazine, I think that was mainly a Shawn development. Yeah. I know my audience.
There used to be wonderful blurbs in the New Yorker that were from publications, actual publications, and there were one-liners at the bottom of the page. And then there were these wonderfully witty one-line comments in response. And they discontinued this. Why?
I can tell you that those things, those little flubs and really stupid copy that you would see at the bottom of the page, those were called news breaks. And the rejoinders were written by E.B. White almost exclusively. Why they got rid of them, I don't know. The New Yorker is a mystery to me in many respects. I did a couple of dozen short pieces for them in the 90s, and then for some, it was mainly after Tina Brown took over that they just didn't want to talk to me anymore. They got incredibly insular. I do not know why they discontinued the news breaks. Certainly I miss them, and I'm sorry that you do. Yeah.
Some people say that the New Yorker declined when they put in a table of contents. What? How do you feel about David Remnick as the editor?
I think David has done a very, very good job. He is the first real reporting editor since Ross. I mean, Sean had been a reporter, but he spent most of his life as an editor. I had a great deal of respect for Bob Gottlieb, who I know slightly, but he was an editor. Tina Brown, was a reporter. Then she became an editor. I think David has a very good sense of what makes for a good story, and good style. And when I was at, I gave a talk at Book Culture with my old friend Mark Singer a few months ago, and he didn't disagree that the New Yorker had a golden age, but I think it's having another golden age right now, especially online. Yeah, oh, right. Oh, and there.
About 15 years ago or so, New Yorker was in serious financial trouble, and Cy Newhouse and I think Steve Florio decided to save it. Essentially, I wondered what during those years, what the relationship with publishing was, and was it a really profitable magazine?
I can't speak to that with any authority because it falls outside of my purview. I do know that the New Yorker was on the ropes very, very early on. Fleischman came within a hair's breadth of pulling out. At the last minute, he decided to stay in. They started turning a profit maybe about 3 years after they were founded, and they did well enough during the Depression. After the war, they got incredibly fat. They really did. But you're right, there was a long time when they were losing money. I don't know what Newhouse and Florio did to turn that around, and I can't speak to their current financial condition. All I know is that despite many travails, financial and editorial, the New Yorker endures, and for that I'm glad.
Could you tell us a few words about
him first?
McPhee would go on and on and on, long essays. It bothered me a lot. Was there anybody else ever bothered by McPhee's endless detail?
Boy, I'm trying. All right, let me see if I can tell this joke correctly. Yes. Someone once said, and I don't know John McPhee at all. I enjoy a lot of his stuff, but someone once said that the 7 worst words in the English language were "first of a series" by John McPhee. I have no complaint. I know you're not the only one who's annoyed. You were back.
Could you tell us a few words about Robert Benchley when he was there as theater critic?
Benchley, I'm in touch with his grandson. In fact, he was at Nat. You're not in the audience now, are you? His grandson. He was at my event here 4.5 years ago. Benchley, I've heard nothing but good things about Benchley. He was one of Gibbs's best friends, and he was so disarming and charming. He would really try to make you feel like you were important and the center of attention. And he was a good theater critic. He could be very trenchant. He could be very biting in the Gibbs mode, but he was often genteel, and it was really Benchley who helped engineer Gibbs as his successor because he was spending more and more time in Hollywood doing his short subjects. He died too young, and as I said, I've heard nothing but good things about him.
I wanted to invite you to say something about a couple of figures you haven't mentioned, Joseph Mitchell and A.J. Liebling, and specifically, how much of a role do you think Ross had in shaping their style?
Mitchell, I hope you've read Tom Kunkel's fine biography. Tom is a great guy. Tom Kunkel wrote a superb biography of Ross 20 years ago, Genius in Disguise, and last summer he came out with the biography of Joe Mitchell. I think in Mitchell's case, I mean, he'd been a newspaper reporter, North Carolina background, and I think that, I don't know if it was Ross who had more of an influence on his long narrative pieces than did Sean. He was a seminal figure in the magazine, and I'm very happy that Tom has come out with his biography. I only touch on Mitchell a bit because he wasn't quite part of the circle that I was writing about. Liebling more so because, among many other things, he and Gibbs shared a love of boxing. You can understand Liebling, you know, a very hardy guy. Gibbs was a shrimp physically, but he was very interested in the sweet science. And it was really St. Clair McKelway who helped mold Liebling's writing. McKelway had been there for a while by the time Liebling came aboard. And there's a story which you may know. Liebling did a multi-part profile of Father Divine, the charismatic preacher. And Liebling had been just a very short staccato newspaper reporter. And he just didn't know how to organize this thing. He had all of this material, he had all of these notes, and he said, my God, this is turning into a comparative case study of religion. You know, it was just getting out of hand. But McKelway helped guide and shape the material, and that's why they have a joint byline on the series.
Earlier, you mentioned that Ross wanted mostly opinion, not opinion.
No, he
wanted facts, not
yes,
opinion.
yeah.
But it sounded, even from the excerpt of the planetarium, it sounded like there was a lot of opinion and
well, notes and comment was and is the closest thing that the magazine has to an editorial page. But in those days, White's touch was, I would say, lighter, not nearly as editorializing. It was mostly wry observation. Then, as war beckoned, things got more serious, and so you did see a lot more editorializing going on.
I don't have a question. I want to tell you a fact that might be relevant to the length of the articles. I don't know whether it's true now, but when I was in the magazine business for many decades, New Yorker writers were paid by the inch.
It's a good way to be paid, depending on what the inch applies to, of course. No, I think various writers had various payment arrangements. I'm sure some of them were paid by the inch. Others had, exactly. Others had contracts. There were different, but you know, the inch was often a way of payment. Okay, that's right. Or the word. Okay, I'm going to tell you about. This was a bit of a cheat. It's not so much his sex life as the great affair of his life, and I'm very proud to have dug this up. By way of background, Gibbs was married 3 times. The first marriage was a disaster. It lasted a very short time. He was very young. He was a cub reporter on Long Island, and no one knew this woman's identity. I found it out. Gibbs's own son didn't know who his father had been married to. I dug up the record at the Nassau County Clerk's office. And then her name was Helen Galpin, and I contacted her son from a subsequent marriage, and he gave me some very important information about his mother, and then I never spoke with him again because I think I creeped him out. He was married the second time for less than a year to a woman named Elizabeth Crawford, and tragically, she committed suicide. She jumped out of their 17th-story window at Tudor City. His third marriage was to Eleanor, who you saw, and I was fairly happy, but between his second and his third marriage, he had an incredible affair, and this is the story of that. Around that time, Gibbs met the apparent love of his life, Nancy Hale, a writer at Vogue who began contributing to The New Yorker in 1929. The granddaughter of Edward Everett Hale and the great niece of Harriet Beecher Stowe. She would eventually become well known for novels and short stories about New England and the complex lives of fashionable women. Hale was elegant, distinguished, frank, and beautiful, and Gibbs was her editor. It was not long before they became romantically involved. Their affair apparently began in either the latter half of 1930 or the first half of 1931. From the start, he was besotted, and for the better part of 2 years, he maintained a uniquely barbed tone of infatuation. And I have here a few excerpts from 60 pages of love letters that I found at Smith College. This is Gibbs. It seems very likely to me that I'm going to die at about 4 o'clock this afternoon, unless you telephone me or something. I love you because you're smarter and better looking than anyone I know, and have the most appalling character. These are love letters. I miss you terribly already, and I'm beginning to get some fine, morbid ideas. I can see you sitting on the nice, clean sand and making up your mind that I'm a sort of mushroom growth, urban and sickly, and not practical at all. Christ, a year ago, I didn't give a goddamn whether I could write, or how I looked, or what people thought about me, and now I want to be swell at everything, so that you'll think of me as a bargain. When you're away, I equip you with a beauty and wisdom and nobility of character that would be quite impossible in a human being, like the girls who were always kicking off with TB in old poems. I wouldn't like it at all if you were really like that, but there's a gloomy satisfaction at the moment. Darling, I wish loving you didn't make me talk silly. There was only one problem. Hale was married to one Taylor Scott Hardin, and the couple had a child, a baby boy named Mark. The marriage was admittedly rocky, and Gibbs spilled much ink trying to persuade Hale to leave her husband for him. Hale and Hardin did eventually divorce. In 1936, she would marry again to the Time Inc. writer and editor Charles Wurtenbaker, and then again to the University of Virginia English professor Fredson Thayer Bowers. But she did not wed Gibbs. Sometime in the spring of 1933, Hale determined that she would try to make her union with Hardin work. She seems to have insisted that she and Gibbs separate for a year, making no promises about what would happen when the 12 months were up. The news devastated him. Darling, I've spent 2 days now just on the edge of putting my head down and howling like a dog. Everything seems to be in some damn kind of conspiracy to make it worse. The telephone has been ringing every 10 minutes, and I always answer it just as hopefully, and every book or paper I pick up has something in it that brings me right back to you again. I just sat here and made up lists of the things that aren't going to be anymore. No more having you walk into speakeasies, mostly legs, to meet me for lunch. No more little bed that falls apart in the night. No more taxi rides when I could kiss you. Oh, darling, whatever happens, I'm so damn glad that you've slept with me, and I have something to remember. Poor guy. Poor guy. Is that all right? How's that? I guess I thank you, and buy a book.
And that's it. So Tom will be here to sign books. I hope that some of you will want to buy one of them. Okay? And we will resume next fall.